There are two types of knowledge: the higher knowledge and the lower knowledge. The lower knowledge deals with the material world, while the higher knowledge leads to the realization of the eternal truth. Just as a spider creates a web and then withdraws it unto itself, in the same way, the universe is created and sustained by the Supreme Being and then dissolved back into it. The supreme truth is not attained through mere intellectual understanding or rituals. It is realized through unwavering devotion, contemplation, and self-discipline. The knowledge of the self destroys all ignorance and leads to liberation. The self is realized through the guidance of a realized teacher and through one's own earnest seeking. The self is not an object of perception or known through external means. It is realized through intuitive wisdom and self-realization. The self, which is subtler than the subtlest and greater than the greatest, dwells within the heart of every being. Those who realize this truth become immortal. Just as a fire is covered by smoke, a mirror by dust, and an embryo by the womb, the knowledge of the self is veiled by ignorance. Remove the veil and realize the eternal truth. The true nature of the self is pure consciousness, eternal, and beyond all limitations. Realize the self and attain supreme knowledge and liberation. Just as the sun, which is the eye of the world, cannot be contaminated by the defects of the objects it illumines, the self, which is the innermost essence of all beings, remains untouched by the actions and experiences of the individual. The self is the eternal witness within, the silent observer of all experiences. Realize the self and transcend the limitations of the individual self. The knowledge of the self is the supreme knowledge. It dispels all doubts, destroys all sins, and leads to liberation. Just as rainwater falling on a mountain peak flows down in various streams, so too, the one eternal truth is known by different names and forms. The self is the eternal source of joy and fulfillment. Those who realize the self go beyond all sorrow and find supreme bliss. The one who sees the unity of all beings and recognizes the divine presence within them, attains oneness with the Supreme Being. As rainwater falling on a mountain peak flows down in different directions, the various paths of spiritual practices lead to the same ultimate truth. The knowledge of the self is the supreme knowledge, surpassing all other forms of knowledge. It leads to liberation and ultimate fulfillment. Those who have attained self-realization see the divine presence in all beings and treat them with love and respect, for they see the unity of all existence. Just as the fire hidden within the wood is revealed through friction, the divine spark within the heart is realized through spiritual practices and self-discipline. The Supreme Self is beyond the reach of the senses and the mind, yet it can be realized through pure consciousness and inner awakening. The wise seek to know that which cannot be known through ordinary knowledge, for it is the source of all knowledge. The self is not known through rituals, sacrifices, or external observances. It is known through deep contemplation, self-inquiry, and realization. The mind, when purified and disciplined, becomes a powerful instrument for self-realization and attaining higher knowledge. The ultimate truth is beyond the realm of words and thoughts. It can only be realized through direct experience and inner realization. The ignorant are attached to the external world, while the wise seek the eternal truth within themselves and transcend the limitations of the material realm. The self, though hidden, shines forth through those who have realized it, just as the sun reveals itself through the removal of clouds. The true nature of the self is pure consciousness, beyond all dualities and limitations. Realize the self and transcend the world of duality. The path to self-realization requires discipline, self-control, and unwavering devotion. It is through such practices that the self is revealed. Just as a spider spins its web and withdraws it, the whole universe is projected and withdrawn by the power of the self. Those who realize the self within themselves go beyond sorrow, delusion, and death, and attain immortality. The self is the eternal source of all beings, the ultimate reality behind the appearances. Realize the self and attain true wisdom. The true nature of the self is beyond words and thoughts, yet it can be realized through deep contemplation and self-inquiry. The world is a combination of the perishable and the imperishable. Seek the imperishable, the eternal truth, and transcend the cycle of birth and death. The self is realized through deep contemplation, self-discipline, and the grace of the divine. It is the supreme goal of human existence. The self is the eternal witness within, untouched by the experiences of the individual. Realize the self and go beyond all limitations. The ultimate truth is not known through mere intellectual understanding, but through direct realization and experiential knowledge. The Supreme Self, though dwelling within the body, is beyond the grasp of the senses. Realize the self and attain eternal bliss. The self is hidden within all beings, like butter concealed within milk. Realize the self through the practice of meditation and self-discipline. The supreme truth is beyond the grasp of the senses, beyond thought and speech. It is known through the purity of the heart and the realization of the self. Those who realize the self become free from all limitations and divisions. They see the unity of all existence and attain supreme peace. The self is the eternal source of all knowledge, the innermost essence of all beings. Realize the self and become one with the eternal truth. The realization of the self is the highest knowledge, surpassing all other forms of knowledge. It leads to liberation and eternal peace. Just as a fire, though one, can be kindled in many ways, the realization of the self can be attained through various paths of spiritual practices. The self, when realized, brings true understanding and fulfillment. It is the ultimate goal of human life. The ignorant are attached to external objects and desires, while the wise seek the eternal truth within themselves and find lasting joy. The realization of the self is not dependent on caste, creed, or social status. It is open to all who seek it with sincerity and devotion. The self is the eternal source of all creation, preservation, and dissolution. Realize the self and become one with the cosmic order. The self, when realized, brings freedom from all bondage and limitations. It is the ultimate refuge and source of eternal bliss. The true knowledge of the self dispels all ignorance and reveals the underlying unity of all existence. The self is not an object of external perception, it is to be realized through deep introspection and self-inquiry. The realization of the self brings about the dissolution of all dualities and leads to the experience of oneness and supreme peace.